welcome to today's webinar focusing on R21. I'm just going to go through a bit of housekeeping before we pass over to Colette. So today I'm Amelia Bray and I'll be facilitating today's event. So I'll be looking after the slides, and any questions you have, I'll be able to pass those over to the relevant people. We'll be joined today by Colette, Richard and Ryan, who'll be able to hopefully answer the questions that you may have. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get going. So if you could keep your videos and microphones turned off and less speaking, that would be great, just because that saves a bit of bandwidth. So yes, and today the event is being recorded, so we will have this recording available next week on the rec portal. And you'll see in a second, we'll go on to the agenda, but we're going to use Slido for our Q&A session today. So what I'll do is I'm hoping you should all be able to see that screen there. So if you can scan that on your smartphone, and you should be able to ask questions, or alternatively, you can type in that number when you go into slido.com. Also, if you're using the Teams desktop browser, you should see an S at the top in the grey taskbar. If you click that, you can ask your questions there as well. And then, as said, this is the agenda for today. So what I will do is I'll pass over to Colette to begin today's session. And as I said, please feel free to ask questions throughout, but there is a designated section towards the end. Thanks, Colette.
Great. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending today's session. I had one or two questions that were coming in as people were starting to prepare to implement R21, so I thought it would be useful to create an opportunity for us to just whip through those questions face to face, so to speak, and give you the chance to clarify anything else. In terms of the numbers of people, thank you very much for the interest. Wasn't quite expecting so many people to have so many questions, and that panicked me a little, but hopefully you've all got similar questions. So through the presentation and then get to the Q&A session. So thank you for those who sent some questions in advance, but don't feel you can't ask more questions, so that's why we're all here. As Amelia said, we've got Richard Colwell from Dacusa, who's going to talk through the accession process for Dacusa and just overview of the Dacusa change, and Ryan Dale from the Code Managers technical team, who's going to talk about the data flows and any other concerns you might have about the technical elements of the solution. So we are here to answer your questions. Okay, so firstly, let me just give you a quick whistle-stop tour of R21. So the intention of this was to create a new role in the REC, which existing REC members can apply to become. So they would have to accede to Dacusa as a safe isolator provider, and they can then work directly for the premise owners, landlords, or people who own their own homes for the installation of an isolator, or as part of a process for installing low and zero carbon technology equipment. So people are going gung-ho for electric vehicle charging points and hopefully heat pumps as well. So this creates a mechanism where that work doesn't have to go through the supplier. It's important to note that the MEM, although the SIP will be a MEM, they're on site only as a SIP, and when they are there, they're not allowed to act as a MEM and perform any of the other activities they would do as a MEM. And what they're allowed to do is strictly limited by what's been set out in Dacusa legal text. So it's there just to facilitate the fitting of the isolator. They cannot, as I say, perform any other things like moving the meter or exchanging it. It's simply fit the isolator to allow the other work to take place. You won't need the consent of the supplier to undertake this work because it's a very narrow scope of activities. Apologies for my dog, if you can hear him. And we are creating facilities for SIPs and suppliers and DNOs to talk to each other through this process. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, the work of the SIP is very closely defined, and the legal text is very clearly specified that the SIP will be allowed to de-energise the metering point if necessary, adjust the terminals of the meter and any associated equipment to remake the connection if necessary, and caused by any disturbance of the connection that might have occurred. And if required, terminate any replacement customer tails into the supplier's meter, the customer tails having been presented and tested by the electrical contractor as part of their works, not as part of the SIP's activity, and then allowed to re-energise the metering point. Okay. So, Richard, if you want to just do us a quick whistle-stop tour of DCP 394, please.
Yep, not a problem. Thank you, Colette. Yeah, so DCP 394 was raised in conjunction with the rec change, and effectively what DCP 394 does is establish the necessary legal arrangements which would allow a rec accredited mem to accede to Dacusa in order to act as a SIP to undertake those safe isolation works that Colette's just talked through. Now, what that means is, as a SIP, you would be interacting with DNO, IDNO, and suppliers' equipment. And what Dacusa does is sets up that legal relationship. You know, so what happens when you interact with that? What can you do? And specifically, the legal text talks about the condition that only a REC accredited mem can apply to become a SIP. That's the main sort of, you know, box you need to tick, really. The definition of a safe isolation works, which Colette's touched on. Obligation that work will only be undertaken by someone working on behalf of the SIP and with the permission of the customer. And obligations that the SIP will act in accordance with good industry practice and comply with the REC meter operator code of practice. And then there's clauses in relation to provisions of information. So, you know, what information needs to go to the supplier and the distributor prior to the job and after the job, and that is particularly picked up within the rec change. So a few new flows are being created, which I believe Colette's going to touch on a bit later on. Clauses in relation to liability, in relation to any actions, proceedings, costs, demands, claims, expenses, liability, loss or damage. So that's the legal bit where obviously there's various different parties interacting with each other's assets. Now, hopefully, you know, nothing will go wrong, but clearly in the background with all these things, there's liability things. So, you know, what happens when that, if anything does happen, and who picks up the costs. Confirmation that the SIP can raise changes and vote on changes specific to the legal text introduced by DCP 394. So what that's saying is, if a distributor, also a DNO or supplier, accedes to Dacusa, which are predominantly the main, you know, if you look at how many people accede to Dacusa, predominantly they're either a DNO, IDNO, or supplier. They contribute to costs. They sit on the panel and board. There's lots of things. The SIP has been excluded from many of these things, but it was deemed appropriate that clauses that relate to that work, a SIP party is able to raise a change and vote on those changes specific to the clauses that relate to that. That's it in a nutshell. So I'll hand back to Colette unless there's any questions at this stage.
I do have one question, but I'm not sure if it refers to you or Colette. But is there a process noted for the replacement of a meter found to be deficient, such as a broken or heat damaged terminals?
We made it clear in the, or I made it clear in the earlier presentation slides that the SIP is not really there to undertake the functions of the MEM on site. So we would expect that the SIP would report the damage to the supplier so that they can instruct their MEM to attend the site and address whatever fault it is that's been identified.
Thank you. That's the only question that's in so far on Slido.
At this point, actually, I'm going to hand over to Ryan, who's just going to take us through the data flow changes and market message. So that.
Yeah, no worries. Good morning, all. Apologies for my slight croakiness, suffering with the lurgy that seems to be going around at the moment. But I will give you a brief overview of some of the technical requirements of R21. If you could hop onto the next slide. I've kept it fairly simple, so a lot more of the technical changes to existing data flows are outlined in the final change report. There's some 9 flows with additional scenario variants added. The 10th flow is a new market message, which is detailed here. And so this flow is to confirm that energization status of a metering point has been changed, or notifies that the terminals of the meter and associated equipment have been adjusted. And that will be moving from the safe isolator provider to electricity suppliers. We don't yet have the official reference for that as yet, but that will be provided in due course. If you could hop on to the next slide, please. So these are the data items contained within the new market message. We've expanded on the address line details. I think it's possible some of the original literature might have just only had less address line details. We've decided to add in full breadth of address line information, but that's the only adjustment. And then we're just waiting for the sort of reference numbers for the SIP ID just to be confirmed. And then finally, next slide, please. Can we have the next slide if possible? Thank you. There we go. Oh no, that's 2. And then, as mentioned on that previous slide, the new data item that we're adding is just the unique reference for a safe isolation provider, and that's the detail and how that's going to be presented on the new data flow. There's also a link on this slide. I believe the slides have already been provided, but if not, obviously following the call we can do. There's a link there for the change and how that's reflected in EMAR, the change set there, so that you're able to review that soon. But yeah, that's a kind of whistle stop tour of the technical impacts of the change, and then obviously if there's any further questions, I'll happily take those.
Yeah, there are a few that have come in. So there's a question here saying it's just been shown on the slide of the scope a SIP can do, which states the SIP will work on the DNO and metering equipment. Richard stated that the SIP will only, I feel like we run out of. That was said by Kevin. I didn't know if you wanted to ask that verbally because it just stopped. So we can come back to that one because I think.
Sorry, it's actually a bit further down.
Okay. Oh yeah, Richard states that while going through the slides, SIP will only deal with DNO equipment. It seems contradictory.
So it would interact with DNO and supplier equipment. So when acceding to Dacusa, that's effectively establishing that legal relationship to allow for those works. So apologies if I didn't say supplier also.
Okay, thank you. When will the reference numbers be confirmed?
I'm not sure about the timescales relating to the change. Colette, do you know if there's a kind of deadline for that information to be confirmed?
Which data are we talking about? Sorry,
the reference number for the data flow, the new market message.
I'm not sure on that one. I must admit, I thought that sat in your area rather than mine.
Okay, I didn't know whether there were sort of time scales related to the change process itself, but yeah, it's not available at this point. We'll be looking to get it confirmed as part of finalisation of the change.
Okay, thank you. Then regarding flows, will there be a mandatory requirement to take meter readings, or is that the flow item not mandatory?
I'm not sure if this came out through workshopping. There isn't a requirement for flows to be mandatory in the flow. As I say, I wasn't party to the early workshops for the change, but whether or not there was a decision made to not include readings as a mandatory data item. Again, Colette, I might have to defer to you on that one, I'm afraid.
I think we said that we would only include the meter reading if we left the site de-energized, was the intention, so that it was clear that you know, when the site had been left de-energized, that we knew what reading had been taken at that point, but the purpose of the flow was to confirm to the supplier that the SIP had been on site and when the SIP had been there, but there was no specific requirement to take a reading other than, as I say, as part of the if they were leaving the site de-energized.
Okay. I've got quite a few questions coming in. Does SIP need to use different sealing pliers to those it uses as a MEM?
No, because first and foremost they are a MEM. That's one of the conditions, but to avoid any confusion for the supplier of record at the time, because it might be that the sealing pliers belonging to another MEM are being used on a site, they will be traceable back through the SIP route to through the use of the data flow to say that it was that particular SIP that was on site at that time, and there's no intention to give out new sealing pliers for SIP roles.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious we've got quite a few questions, so I don't know if it's worth going on to the next bit and then we can just display them all when we're in the Q&A section.
It's probably a good approach, actually.
Yeah, because at least then you can see the questions that are coming in.
Okay, yeah. Let's just whip forward then. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so at this point, we're going to hand over to Richard to talk about onboarding with Dacusa, and then I'll talk about the interactions with the REC.
Apologies. Yeah, thank you, Colette. Yeah, so the accession application for Dacusa is relatively straightforward. So I think initially you can contact us at any. Am I a bit louder now? Apologies for that. I think my mic might have dropped a little bit. But this flow chart sort of talks through the process. Now, initially, you can contact us at Dacusa at any time, and we can talk you through this. The first couple of points are specific, really, to DNOs and IDNOs. So it talks about the need for a market participant ID, and it talks about the need for an off-gem license. The fourth flow is in relation to safe isolation providers, so SIPs acceding to Dacusa, and the main point being that you need to be a REC accredited MEM before you can start the application to become a Dacusa party. And the next one it provides a few links, so you can either submit the accession online or you can download the accession form, and then you will submit that to us at Dacusa, and that accession will be presented at the next Dacusa open panel. So that's in open governance. Here is an application, and that panel will review. So in this particular case, there would have been some interaction between Dacusa and REC to say, we've received this application. Is this party a REC accredited MEM? And if that is confirmed by REC, we will present that to the panel, and they will make a decision of whether they refer that to the Dacusa board to be signed and then step into the process. So what tends to happen is it will be presented at the open panel, for example, in May. The panel will agree for that to be presented to be then signed by the board. So that will be presented the following month. So during that month, we will provide, and it generally happens through DocuSign, but if people don't have access to that, we can facilitate that. It might be that you can print it out, sign, and then scan it. You know, there's mechanisms to ensure that the appropriate paperwork is signed. That gets presented to the board, who then will agree and sign that, and then you'll get confirmation from Dacusa that that has happened. Yeah, so the agreement will be signed, and then you will also be provided access to the website. So there will be a SIP party access to the website. If that's really it. So the key aspect is being a REC accredited MEM, and then you've indicated desire to become a SIP, and you're signing up to Dacusa to effectively sign on the dotted line to the clauses that are contained within the Dacusa document. which I talked about on the previous slides.
Thanks, Richard. I think you mentioned the interaction with the REC, so it's probably a good point to sort of just whip through then those interactions. So in the first instance, should a MEM contact our service desk to ask about how they become a SIP, we would direct them obviously to yourselves and start that process off. Obviously, as you said, Dacusa will need to confirm that, so we would expect Dacusa to send a note through to our service desk, and they will confirm back to yourselves whether that party is registered as a MEM. You will then do your internal work to progress the application, and at some point when you complete that process, you'll notify the REC through the service desk that that process is complete. And at that point, the REC will update the party register, and the OAM that looks after that particular MEM will confirm through to the MEM that they now have the status of SIP. If there's any reason for Dacusa to reject an application, that will be managed through their processes. So this is the onboarding process, which is fairly straightforward. Obviously, we have to consider the exiting arrangements as well. So we just want to flick to the next slide for me, please. So there are two sort of exit routes, really. A MEM decides that they want to cease working as a SIP, but want to carry on working as a MEM. So they will contact Dacusa and say that they want to voluntarily exit. And Dacusa will advise the REC that the SIP session exit is pending. At that point, our service desk will be advised so that the OAM can just confirm that's okay with the MEM and that was intentional. And then when Dacusa confirm the exit, then service desk will get notified, and the OAM will be informed, and the exit confirmed back to the MEM. The exit is complete. There's the other side of the scenario where Dacusa decide to give notice to terminate, and that could be because a MEM has for whatever reason lost their role as a MEM, and that might be through actions from the PAB, probably through actions from the PAB. And so as a consequence of that, our service desk, the OAM, will pass the information through to Dacusa to advise of the termination requirement, and there'll be an opportunity, I presume, for the SIP to appeal any decision to terminate within Dacusa. Whether that appeal is resolved, there's an appeal pending. There'll be obviously conversations going on between the REC and the Dacusa at that time, and then depending on the outcome of that appeal, it will either be that everything is hunky-dory and stays as is, or ultimately the SIP will then confirm they've exited the Dacusa contract, which will be then a notification back to the REC service desk, who will confirm the exit has completed. So the REC party register will be updated to remove the SIP role from the party register. Anything affecting the MEM role is other than the degree to which it affects the SIP activities, but anything to do with the MEM directly will be dealt with under the MEM processes. So that's a sort of whistle-stop tour of the accession process and then the exit process. Okay, so we're now reached the meaty part of the meeting, and really to talk through your questions and answers, and we can see that we've got quite a lively number of questions coming in. So let's first question, Mark, you raised some questions in advance of the meeting, and just for sort of clarity, it's worth talking those through for you. So where is the new obligation in REC for the SIP to send the 139 or the new market message? In the legal text. I must admit, sorry, I missed. I thought this was a technical question, so I haven't actually checked you that one. Apologies, Mark. I'll come back to you shortly on that. Question 1. Apologies, that's embarrassing. Okay, question 2. Should the SIP send the D139 to the supplier MEM or both? No, the interaction is just between the supplier and the SIP. So if you need to send anything, you send just to the supplier, and then the supplier will make sure that their MEM is informed. If the latter two, it makes the whole process simpler for suppliers, as this is what happens today. Yes, except we didn't expect to create a mechanism for lots of flows. It was to try and keep the flow process fairly simple, that there would be just one instance, one set of communications between the SIP and the supplier. If the SIP only sends 139 to the supplier, how are suppliers supposed to notify the MEM, as there is no DTM flow to do this? It's a question really for suppliers to answer. We didn't prescribe a solution, and as you say, there isn't a particularly defined flow to do that. This wasn't raised as an issue during the assessment of the change. So if it needed to be done via this flow to the MEM, that would have to be an additional change. The 4th question: when does the SIP send the new SIP event completed? Is this in addition to the 139? Only when PSR is collected. So the SIP should send the flow in, the new flow in all cases. The idea being that it's evidence for the supplier that the SIP's been on site and that they've, completed the actions by isolating and reconnecting the meter. Is it in addition to the 139? If the 139 is needed, yes, it's in addition, and only when the PSR data is collected. The PSR data should be notified whenever it's collected. If the SIP identifies something that they weren't pre-warned of, or the SIP doesn't believe, well, no, actually, the SIP should, if they are aware of PSR information, they should send it in all instances to the supplier, because at this point it may well be that the supplier is unaware of the information that the SIP might see on site, and therefore it's helpful for the supplier to be made aware of potential vulnerability that they may not already have had notice of. Okay.
Can I just come back on a couple of points on that?
Yes, certainly, go ahead.
On the one where you say, I said about the 139, looking at the documentation I saw, there are new instances of a 139 from the SIP to both the MEM and the supplier. If you're saying the SIP doesn't communicate with the MEM, what's the point of that flow?
Sorry, Ryan, do you want to step in and take this? Because I am not the expert on the flows here, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so the new scenario variants, so we're saying it's missing essentially a variant at this point, is that correct?
Well, no, the documentation I saw is there is a 139, which is obviously change of energization status, going from the SIP to the supplier and to the MEM.
Right.
So my question is does the SIP have to send it to the MEM, because that is the most logical place to send it? Because if he sends it to the MEM would just update the industry like it does today, and the rest of the process follows through a predefined working process. If he only sends it to the supplier has to update their MEM, and there is no process in place today to do that with a flow. You'd have to find some way of doing it, and you'd have to find a GDPR compliant way of doing it. So that was the point around the first ones.
Yeah.
So does that make sense?
It does, yeah. I'm not sure if this is addressed in the legal text, actually. I don't know. I'm just reading through just to see if that's covered in there. But yeah, that does make sense that we would essentially mandate that it's sent between SIP and MEM in all cases, and then
yes,
additionally to supplier as a
that was the most logical thing. The other thing on the PSR, this new flow, which has some PSR data in it, that's completely inadequate to collect PSR, because for a start, it only allows the SIP to collect one PSR code.
Yeah, I raised that one internally actually, and I think we can set that to 1 to numerous, or sorry, 0 to numerous, should I say, which would make sense. I just need to clarify the governance as far as the change is concerned. If we can do that, then that would be my suggestion as well.
Yeah. The other thing with that is that's still no good for a supplier then to be able to update the industry. The supplier would still have to contact, because there is a lot of other data you're supposed to collect, like if it's things like you need, or you try to get alternate contact numbers, names, so that when it's past the DNO, they have other people to contact. So it needs to replicate everything that's in the 225. So there's one. There's another one. There's 2 ways of doing it. But no, there's probably 3. One is you change the new flow. That seems a lot of duplication. 2 is you just put a flag in there that says to advise the supplier that the PSR is not up to date. And I'm not sure where they'd have the PSR anyway in the first place.
No, they won't.
They won't. So they may be telling us stuff we do know. So it's a case of what do they collect? Or the third one is to say, well, you put an onus on them to collect everything, and then they send it to a 225 to the supplier. Because what you've got at the moment doesn't do anything for anybody. It's just a bit of information that on its own, no disrespect to the original design, is basically to the supplier as a recipient useless. All it says is I found a PSR on site, and then the supplier is going to have to, I would guess, then think, okay, I'm now going to have to contact this customer and go through the whole thing again.
The intention was not to try and supplement the supplier's obligations to collect PSR information. Having met its license obligation, should already have a good understanding of the PSR information at site. We know that's not always perfect, and we do know that customers sometimes don't share information with the supplier regarding vulnerability. Certainly, particularly elderly people tend to see some of this as very private and personal information and don't necessarily want to tell their supplier about it. The thing we identified with this change early doors was that it may well be that there's a requirement that the SIP does its risk assessment, and it identifies obvious things that would affect their ability to de-energise and re-energise the site, that they obviously have under a risk assessment would have identified that, would have collected that information, and it was felt as useful at the I think it was at the MEP where the decision on the change was made, that it was felt that it would be useful for the SIP to send that information to the supplier. It wasn't to create an obligation on the supplier to collect all the PSR information and for the supplier to rely on the SIP collecting that information for them. It was felt to be supplementary information that would be considered useful that the supplier would have, but it was not intended to be the opportunity for the supplier to update and validate. It was more of a while we're on site, this is what we found. We think the supplier needs to be aware, and they may already have it, but it was a case of we've identified it on site, therefore we're flowing the information back to the supplier, but it's their responsibility to undertake any checks and take any action as a consequence of the information, and also recognizing that it would not necessarily be the complete information, because it may well be that they will only visually assess sort of identify PSR scenario related to the isolation. And so, if they walked into a home and the customer had a home dialysis unit, there might be a question, does the supplier know about that? There's no expectation that the SIP will validate that with the supplier before they send it. They will just send it. And if the supplier already has it, yay. If they haven't, then update their records, but they will also make sure that they've got it up to the supplier to make sure that their PSR information is as accurate as it should be.
In that case, then the flow does need changing it, because they can only send one thing. So that obviously needs to change in case they spot more than one thing, so that they can capture whatever they
Whatever
this
they
spot at the
see.
time, whatever they
Yeah.
see at that time.
That's
and then
great feedback.
suppliers will
Thank
have
you.
to act accordingly on that.
And it is
There's-
down to the supplier to decide what to do with it. You know, we're not trying to prescribe in here. We're saying the SIP's been on site. They've seen something that they feel that the supplier it should be aware of from a PSR perspective. And so that information is then sent to the supplier, but it's then the supplier's responsibility to deal with it.
Yeah.
And if that means updating the DNO as well, then that's part of the supplier's requirements rather than the SIP's.
Yeah. My only other comment on which I hadn't put on the questions, I'll just tack it on very quickly
Go
now,
for
was
it. Yeah.
on the new flows. I'm not sure of the point of putting the supplier or SIP IDs in there because they're in the header. They are in the header of the file. We don't do that in other DTC flows, or DTN flows, should I say? So I don't know why you've chosen to do that in this case.
Question for Mark. Sorry, for Ryan. Sorry.
Yeah, no particular sort of decision was made. Just how we approached the design of the new flow. Yeah, again, I don't know what the governance is like on making adjustments at this point, but happy to consider that and revise if possible.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Just to add quickly, there were a couple of other questions I spotted on the poll, on the Q&A on the Slido, which I've responded to in the chat. Both sort of data flow type questions. So yeah, just so you know.
So on that question on the legal text markup, we are going to publish Q&A responses. It might take us a couple of days to work it all through, but we'll make sure all the questions that have been captured get a full response. So you'll definitely see that in the next few days. Okay, so shall we move on to the next question? Can the SIP send industry data flows to the DNO, e.g. the D135 reporting issues with the cutout? Is that one of the flows identified, Ryan?
The 135 is on the list. Bear with me just a second. So the variant added for this was SIP to Supply Fault Information Center. So I don't think that's DNO. So there isn't a variant to do so. There is. Let me see. Yeah, so that's the only additional variant we've added for 135.
That's going to cause a problem, I suppose the question is. Do you want, are you on the call? We must be, sorry, silly question. And do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, it's just that they'll have to do their risk assessment when they're on site. If they can't actually send back what they're finding, because they won't be able to work on certain codes if they find them. So if they found an asset A or an asset B, they have to be able to send a flow to the DNO to let them know that there's something wrong with that equipment, and they need to cease work as well.
Are you talking about the A, B and C notifications?
Yeah.
Yeah, we envisaged that would be the normal process that the MEM would follow if they, or the SIP would follow, sorry. That if the SIP found what we classed as danger, damage or interference, that they would follow the normal process of creating category B faults.
So is there?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's contained within the Dacusa legal text as well. That so effectively, yeah, as a MEM would do now, if they come across something that posed immediate danger, you would call it in, and if you are able to resolve the issue, then a category B would be reported.
So sorry, can I just ask a question on that as well?
Yeah.
The category Bs are only we've been penalised before for reporting a category B where a meter has been exchanged. So my understanding is that category Bs should only be reported when they prevent the exchange of a meter, and the SIP won't be exchanging the meter.
No,
So
right.
should they be in a position to be reporting category Bs?
think
Richard?
during the working group, I think it was acknowledged that many of the category Bs may not be relevant. But there may be, I guess, a case where you're unable to undertake the work, or if you de-energized and then for whatever reason were unable to re-energize due to an issue, the cutout, a category B would be reported. I think the DNO will see that it's from a SIP, and then I think that they will separate that from their standard smart metering type reporting. So I think really it was clearly, if there was an issue that needed to be resolved, it would be reported through a category B. So I'm not sure
I don't,
how.
although I don't think they should be working on that. I think if we're not allowed to change the meter, they shouldn't be touching the DNO equipment or the meter if they come across a B code when they carry out the risk assessment. If we can't change a meter and pull the fuse, then they shouldn't be able to pull the fuse and install an isolator. And I think all B codes would be still relevant. If we can find it when we're going to do a meter change, surely to God we could find it if we were going to fit an isolator. I don't know anybody else's opinion on that, but you can see somebody's got their hand up.
Yeah, so it's interesting that, isn't it? Because the SIP goes out to de-energize to allow for safe working. They don't do any work in between as a SIP. It may be that they sort of take their SIP hat off, if that makes sense, and they go, oh, now I'm a contractor here to install an isolator or change the consumer unit. I guess at the point of de-energizing, if there's an issue, they raise a category B and no other work continues because it can't happen safely. Or they've perhaps made safe, but they need to inform the DNO that who to come out and obviously put a more sustainable solution in place.
I can't remember it.
Are you okay for me to talk on that?
Yes.
Yeah, so the category A, B and C's are the conditions of the cutout that you find when you go on site. So if you see a category A on a cutout, then you're going to phone that into the DNO straight away because it's a dangerous situation on site that needs a DNO to respond within 3 hours and sort. If it's a category B that stops you from doing the task, then you would not do the task and you would report the category B in the normal way. An example of that is where the fuse cannot be removed from the cutout because it's in place. That's treated as a category B. But for example, you wouldn't be able to do the task. So therefore, you would just simply report it as a category B following the normal data flow issues. Same as you might see plenty of category C issues as well, which you would report, but they might not stop you from fitting the isolation switch. If they don't, then you would still report them as a category C. That's the normal course of events so that the DNO has a record of all the issues that they have with their cutouts in different sites and can plan the jobs to go and do the maintenance on those cutouts that's required. When we send those data flows, we get data flows back telling us whether the DNO have actually solved the issues or not. And they're sort of matter of courtesy ones, really.
So in other words, the same rules apply?
Yeah, same rules apply. It's no different.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Phillip Price is desperate to speak. He's got his hand up, so it's been up for a little while.
Oh, that was me just then.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Apologies. Okay, just let you take your hand down then. Okay.
I think there's a few hands as well up. I
Just
think
going to
Phil
ask
popped, yeah.
Mark's next, I think.
Yeah, so does that mean you're going to be introducing a new instance of the 135 from the SIP to SFIC and then presumably potentially a response back? Is that another instance of a new instance of a flow that you're going to have to introduce as part of the complete set of these changes?
Sorry, Mark, could you just say from the SIP to who?
From the SIP to, I think it's SFIC. They're the fault information center. They're part of the DNO. They're the bit you tell them when something's wrong.
Oh, right.
So is that a new instance that is of another, is that another flow change you're going to need to make by introducing another instance?
Is that the normal mechanism for reporting it? Yes, because the intention was to use the existing mechanisms that would normally happen for category A, Bs and Cs.
Well, yeah, but the normal mechanism is for the MEM who is appointed to
Yeah.
that metering point to send it to the SFIC. This
Yeah.
isn't the MEM working there. This
No,
is a
no.
SIP.
Yeah.
So this would have to be a new instance of the flow. So the DNO isn't looking that it's come from the correct
Well,
MEM. It's
yeah.
come from
SIP.
any SIP that's notified him. So that will have to be a new another flow change that you're going to potentially need if that's what people want to happen.
Okay, that sounds pragmatic. We'll have to take that away and just check what we can do with that, because that, I think, sounds like the intention, that's what we wanted to achieve, but somehow it seems like we might have missed that scenario variant. Leave that one with us. Phil Waring, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to retract back a bit here. The idea of being a SIP and installing an isolator was that, in essence, you're already a accredited meter operator working under the MACOP regulations and all the codes that go with it. And to actually fit an isolator, you can't fit an isolator with not touching the existing meter at all, because you'll have things like upgrading tails from the cutout to the meter, harmonization issues to contend with. So, you know, I'm not sure if we're going away from the very point of what we were trying to achieve. What we were trying to achieve was for existing MEMS, if you like, to be able to be SIPs as well, and to act as a SIP, but also have the same credentials and credibility to be a MEM, because if you're going to report flows, you have to be associated with an MPID to go back on. So, you know, I don't see how we would expect somebody to install an isolator and not actually have any interaction with the existing meter at all, because just on your duty of care, you should be checking tightness of connections, polarity, harmonization, cable sizes. So I just wanted to make that point.
I think, and someone better informed on this can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the expectation was that the things that you've talked about come within that scope of the things that you reasonably need to do. The tightening of tails was definitely something we talked about in the workshops. And as I say, it was things to do with, I think we used the words sort of like about remaking the connection to make it safe. Was if there was any adjustments that were needed to do that, so that you could leave the site safe, that they were permitted. But obviously what you couldn't do was basically go in and say, oh, well, this company's not, this customer's not got a smart meter, we can do a smart meter exchange while we're here, or we can move the meter location from, you know, sort of under the stairs to an outside meter box. I mean, it was to sort of stop that type of activity and doing things that are within the supplier's control, if you like. But anything that from a safety perspective that you would need to do in order to affect that safe isolation, you would be permitted to do. And I think the Dacusa legal text clearly covers off that type of scenario. If we haven't got the words exactly right, I mean, maybe that's something we need to check with Richard.
So yeah, so I think firstly, if you think about the SIP, that role is purely there to allow for safe working, because obviously, one, it tackles, at the moment, we know that if, for example, there was a block of flats and it had 20 different suppliers in there, if you follow the existing legal regulations, you would need 20 different suppliers to turn up in order to de-energize. It's purely there to allow for safe working. The next stage, whatever happens during that de-energization, is not the SIP. It may be that it is the same person, but they're then acting as the contractor, whatever that work is, working on behalf, you know, to install an isolator, or it might be to change a consumer unit, install an electric vehicle charger. That is separate. The SIP then comes back to re-energize, and it may be that it tweaks or replaces a meter tail if necessary, and that is involved in the legal text. So it was deliberately a very strict, this is what a SIP can do. So I think the bit in between is then the contractor saying, well, now we're using this particular electrician or person, and I guess that due diligence of whether they're signed up to a competency, you know, or any of those things, sits kind of separate.
Makes sense, Philip.
I mean, the only thing that my concern was, I didn't want to end up with being a SIP going back to the days where electrical contractor, for example, fits an isolator, pulls a fuse, but he knows nothing about the requirements of a meter operator. So that's the bit I was concerned about. Is, you know, to me, the real essence behind all of this at the beginning was to make allowances for meter operators to be able to pull fuses to fit isolators where they were not appointed as the meter operator. We have to be very careful if we think a SIP can be accredited to pull a fuse and re-energise a fuse without not understanding all the interactions of the requirements of a fully compliant meter installation.
And that's why we've made the requirement to be specifically that you've got to start out life as an accredited MEM first and foremost before you can apply to be a SIP. And it isn't just a case of any electrical contractor can rack up and become a SIP. You've got to be competent. You've got to meet the test to be the MEM first, and then you can apply to be the SIP. And it's precisely that, so that you know, it was to put some control around the isolation works that are going on. You know, to give a route to market for people to get the job done safely and legally, because at the moment, sort of without any governance around it and technically illegally.
Now that makes sense. I'm happy with that. You know, I think that was that, like you said, the core skill was a MEM first and then a SIP, which is fine.
Yeah, and it's effectively, yeah, you're a rec MEM is doing this all the time, just on meter and points that they're appointed to by the supplier. So that was kind of the next step, if you see what I mean, is to open that up to allow a SIP to work on any meter and point, which clearly we know tackles a lot of some big issues with local authorities, for example, where they go, well, hang on a minute, I'm looking at what I've got to do here, and there's going to be 20 people on site because we want to fit all these isolators. And I think it was sort of the next step with very controlled, you know, if you think about the sort of legal departments and all these companies, they were comfortable with that. And so it takes a step in the right direction of ensuring that work can be done as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Richard. As AMO represents all the meter operators predominantly, the other good thing about that is we all behave in the right manner to each other's, you know, meters and setups. So I think we've got it covered. It's just making the point to everybody. That was all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dave Wright's had his hand up for a little while.
Yeah, thanks, Colette. No, it was just in response to the 135 question. If you're going to change and update that flow, then how's the SIP going to be notified that the work's being done? Because currently the respondent file won't go back to the SIP, so they could have stopped doing work.
Yeah.
And will be sat there for months now. All right, on average 40 days. But work you could end up by making multiple visits. So are you looking at the resultant flow as well as to whether that needs to be redirected back to the SIP?
Absolutely. We expected the normal routes that would happen in those circumstances for those notifications.
But the normal route collects back to the supplier.
Yeah, but the supplier won't tell the SIP because at that point the job's not complete. The supplier won't know who the SIP is. So we'll have to create, if it's not already there, we'll have to create an instance of that flow in this scenario going back to the SIP so that they know they can safely go back and carry out the work, finish the job.
Okay, that's fine, thanks.
Yeah. So can we just, unless it's Mark, it's on this particular point again, can we just sort of whip through some more of the questions, because there's lots of questions queuing, I think, 29 apparently. Okay, so are post completion audits to be carried out on the SIP? If so, whose responsibility? Yes, there will be the same requirement to audit the work of the SIP as there is when they act as a SIP as a MEM. It will come within the same scheme of works. Okay, you said the new flow, what they would say what they have done, but that it is not in, you said new flow would say what they have done, but that is not included in the new flow. I'm not quite sure. Mark, do you want to just articulate that question?
Yeah, when we were getting to talk about the new flow, by whoever said it, they said part of the new flow would be to tell the supplier what had happened, what they'd done on site.
Oh.
But there is nothing in that flow to say what they've done.
The idea would be the fact that the receipt of the flow itself would just tell you that the SIP has been to site. The fact that you're getting the flow means that the SIP attended site and isolated and reconnected, unless you get something in the flow that tells you they've left the site de-energized.
Okay, so yeah, so the purpose as described. Yeah, okay, so you're inferring they've done something rather than being told what they've done.
Yeah,
okay.
The idea is the SIP can only de-energize and re-energize, and if they haven't completed the re-energization, then they need to tell you why they haven't. So it's only in the instance of failure that you'll get extra information. Okay, Claire, will there be a public list of ceiling pliers codes used by SIPs? Well, they'll be using their MEM ceiling pliers when they act as a SIP, because it's that organisation that's accredited. So it will be the existing list wherever you access that now. Okay, Claire. Okay.
So yes, thanks, Colette. Yeah.
Okay. There may be insufficient time to design, build, test, and implement due to the lack of lower level detail. We're going to have a look at the degree to which some of these things are working themselves out now, rather than having worked out in the previous workshop, and to see whether we need to make any significant changes. I think we'll have to consider how we deal with that. But please bear with us on that. We'll come back to you. That effectively answers the next question as well. Will provisions be made if we do not have enough time to create the data item? Will provisions be made if we do not have enough time to create the data item? Does anybody want to own up to the question or just clarify a little bit more on that point? If you want to contact us after the session, the inquiries at the code manager mailbox, we can pick it up there. To confirm, can a MEM act in the capacity of both a MEM and a SIP at the same time on the same job? I think not. You're right, they can't. Unless they happen to be, they wouldn't be there as a SIP though. If they were sent there by the supplier to do the isolation work, they'd be there as the MEM. So no, you're right, that is the correct conclusion. Is there a route for reporting BNC codes and a way of providing visibility of the DNO action? Well, the existing route is, as we've discussed, providing visibility of the DNO action. I think we're taking that one away, aren't we, to look at whether there's an instance of a response coming back to the SIP. I presume that's the level of visibility that you're looking for, Frank. Okay, yes, Frank. I can't hear you, you're on mute.
Sorry, yes, that is what I was referring to, because obviously it's one thing reporting a BNC code, but because obviously you don't have an immediate action for it, like you do with an A, and you know most often we wait on site to meet the DNO and liaise with them to then resolve that. But the BNC code issues are often just in the mire, and we never actually have a report back to say that it's been completed. Rather, short of us contacting the entity that houses the supply, dealing with the customer and asking them if the DNO have been back to return to rectify. There isn't really a mechanism for that as far as I'm aware.
That's, I think, what we're going to have a look at with the D135 to see whether we can get a response file back from the DNO to the SIP.
Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Claire, if a data collector supplier reports the data issued to the MEM, which turns out to have been caused by a SIP, does the MEM need to resolve this? If a data collector reports a date issue to the MEM, which turns out to be caused by, I'm struggling to see what sort of data issue this might be, Claire. Can you be a bit more specific? Because ultimately the SIP is not there to send back industry data. They're only sending a note back to say that they've been to the site on that day and to undertake safe isolation work. So they shouldn't be changing any data. They'll be providing PSR information if they observe it. But I don't believe you would be expecting to see or there be any other data items as a consequence of the SIP's attendance. Is there something you've got in mind?
I was just trying to cover eventualities, Colette. I'm hoping this would never happen, but if perchance the SIP did something that affected the DC's ability to collect data from the site, retrieve data, the DC wouldn't know anything about the SIP having been to site. They would, as per the standard process, raise an issue, a D1 to the MEM saying, we believe there's a faulted site, unable to connect, or data looks spurious, something like that. The MEM would go out to site, and if they then found that something at site, let's say some physical activity at site that the SIP had undertaken had caused the problem, is there an expectation that the MEM needs to resolve that?
I suppose it would depend on what the problem was. I guess. I think that interesting.
Yes, could even be something as simple as DC is seeing zero data because there's been, let's say, some de-energization, but the DC would be unaware of the cause of that.
Yeah, we did cover off in the previous Q&A session that we held scenario where we'd expect where there was a smart meter and so remote data was being retrieved, that the SIP would check that the comms were in the state that they found them in effectively, and so there was information published as to what to check. I think it's also DNOs have helpfully pulled a guidance document together that helps their teams when they go to site and find smart meters to check for the comms are left in the state they found them in.
I'm thinking AMR meters also.
So yeah,
the non-smart meters.
The non-smart meters. Again, I'm struggling really to think. I mean, the thing in the first instance, the MEM will have to attend site if that is the normal process that the data collector would report the problem. The MEM would attend site if there was an issue that it was covered by, and they believe the cause of the problem was the result of the SIP. Then the supplier would know who that SIP was. There was a route there for them to inquire as to sort of what transpired, I suppose. And obviously the liabilities regime sort of sits in the Dacusa agreement if there is any sort of consequential loss as obviously as a consequence of the SIP's work. But it would depend again on the root cause of the problem, I suppose.
I think just kind of picking through the words that you said there, Colette, I think what you inferred there was if that transpired to be the case, then the MEM should or could liaise with the supplier.
Yes. And if the MEM felt that it was something to do with work had been done on site, but it wasn't work they'd done, then obviously they can check with the supplier if there's any record of a SIP having been on site, because the MEM's ceiling pliers would not be the ones that are attached to the site at that time. So it would be obvious that that MEM's ceiling pliers were not on site. It would tell them if they were expecting their ceiling pliers to be there, obviously. It would tell them whose ceiling pliers were there, and the supplier could say whether there's been a SIP present at the site or not in recent period, sort of term. But I think it's very hard to prescribe an answer for that type of question at this point. I think it's going to have to be a case of there is a liabilities framework within Dacusa that would allow for the supplier to claim recompense for any failures that are the responsibility of the SIP. I think we'd have to rely on that route as a resolution. Without some specific examples, it's a bit difficult to sort of foresee the scenarios.
Okay, yeah, as you say, I think we might need to work it through, but it would seem logical to think that the MEM's going to have to resolve it because they're the ones that are qualified to actually work on the metering and on the site.
Yeah, and I mean, the thing is, what you have got is a SIP who is qualified as a MEM, so should be mindful of what they need to do to leave the site in operational order, should report any instances where they can't to the supplier so that the supplier can get their MEM out to do whatever needs to be done. And the SIP should be checking to make sure that they're leaving comms enabled or reporting back to the supplier if comms are not reconnected so that the supplier can arrange for their MEM to go out.
Okay, thanks. Just on that same note, Colette, can I ask another question? And that is there going to be any performance monitoring undertaken on the work of SIPs by, I'm trying to think, would it be REC?
Nothing has been specified as a requirement of introducing this role, other than obviously as part of the work. The MEMs are audited on what they do.
Yeah.
But no, unless we identify a particular risk that then the performance assurance board want to look at, that would be a future issue.
That's maybe something to keep in mind, but it would take the industry to notify you of the risk or of any trends that people are seeing.
Yes.
So maybe that's something that we need to be mindful of or be prepared to do when this first goes live.
Yeah, I mean, it's with any part of any process that is undertaken on behalf of the market. If it is felt that there is a significant risk to industry arrangements, then there's already performance assurance activity in place, and as new activity gets expanded into the market, then obviously the performance assurance role is there to monitor the risks. So it does rely on reporting of instances. So if there is any concerns, the performance assurance route is the way to go. And obviously they're monitoring risks out there as a general rule. I think, the level of comfort you should take around the fact that at the end of the day, what we did was we said that, the people that we were allowing to be SIPs are existing MEMs. So we were not starting from a base of low skill or low knowledge. We're starting from the basis that these are people who work in the industry now, are qualified to work on the meter and work for suppliers in that capacity day in, day out. And therefore, this extra activity, there shouldn't really be a risk of them undertaking this extra work. The difference is that instead of undertaking it at the behest of the supplier, they're undertaking it at the behest of the premise owner. But that still means that they owe a duty of care. And I don't think we should lose sight of that.
No, I think there's as you say, the capability aspect, which is one thing, but I was thinking more about and existing MEMs are monitored, performance monitored for sending of flows, timely sending of flows, quality of the flows, content of the flows, things that can go wrong in any kind of business. So hence my question about monitoring of performance in all aspects or many aspects of the SIP role.
Yeah. And as I say, I think it's a case of at this stage it's not seen as a huge risk, but if things come to light that suggest a more closely monitored arrangements needed, I'm sure that the performance assurance team will identify and track what needs to be done.
Okay, thank you.
I think before taking Frank's question, I think you just want to sort of roll that one into the next question that came up, which was the background as to why MEM's role wasn't expanded to cover these processes rather than introducing a new industry role. The reason why was that MEMS currently, so if I'm a customer and I want an isolator, I have, at the moment, I have one choice, and if I'm following all the appropriate regulation, I should go to my supplier and I ask my supplier to do this, and the supplier will instruct their MEM to do this for me. And so that's an existing function that the MEM has. The problem we've seen and the challenge that's come back is that people who are owners of premises that are not the consumer of energy in those premises want to do things to the fabric of the building or to provide extra services such as electric vehicle charging points, and because they want to do this, having a supplier that, I think Richard said, you know, trying to get multiple suppliers to coordinate to do a program of work, maybe in a block of flats or on a housing estate or whatever, trying to coordinate those activities is more and more complicated. And also that because of the rollout activities, that some suppliers have while they're happy to prioritise the work for their customers, they sort of tend to see the sort of landlords as more of a third party type relationship, and have not been as high a priority for sending MEMS out to do that work. This was allowing a new route into the market for MEMS who had the capacity to do the work, and allowed the landlords and the premise owners access to a service provider when they're not the energy consumer. So that's why it was considered to be a new industry role, but it was felt it was important that it was still somebody who was appropriately qualified. So I think hopefully that sort of covers off that question. Frank, you've taken your hand down, so I assume you were happy. Next question. If abstraction of electricity is found at the time of the visit by the SIP, what's the process? It is what you would do today as a MEM. If you're on site and you find evidence of theft, you report it. And the SIP, I think it's in the legal text, danger, damage or interference. You would be expected to follow the normal processes to address any suspected theft and leave the supplier to do the investigation. Yes, you will get a full list of all of these questions. We will produce a document that answers everything, so yeah, you don't have to rely on trying to take all the notes today. Also, the previous Q&As are published already, and we will be publishing the recording of the session as well, so you'll be able to wade through them all if you like. Phil.
Yeah, just one question as a SIP. If you're acting as a SIP, you may not know who the supplier is. So if you find abstraction, one of the things we thought on the early part of this process is, you know, you're working for a landlord. The landlord's got lots of tenants, all different suppliers. You find abstraction on a meter. I mean, obviously you can go back to your organisation and look at echoes and find out who the supplier is, but you may not have a relationship with that supplier or a contact. So there's a bit of work there to be done for MEMS to, you know, you might not be the appointed MOP for that meter operator and you may not have a contact. So the important thing for the industry here is to make sure that there is a route into all suppliers for a correct contact point to report things like revenue protection issues. It's just a point to raise, that was all.
Yeah, don't forget there's also the normal theft reporting tip line. I think it is ETIOS, I think they'll call it, don't we? So they confirmed they were happy to receive the reports as well.
Yeah, and Colette, I can come in on that. In the Dacusa legal text, it does touch on that. So ideally, you obviously inform the supplier if known, but it's acknowledged that, yeah, you may be a SIP working on behalf of a landlord and you don't know, and it says it shall give notice to the United Kingdom Revenue Protection Association. So I think there's a route to report it there, and then I guess there's mechanisms into the supplier from there.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Excuse me. The new PSR details need to confirm to the 225 obligation, including conditional data items affected to date and additional information.
I think this might have been feeding into the earlier discussion with Mark, just about some of the additional data items to consider for the new flow.
Yeah, excuse me, I'm conscious that we've got 15 minutes left on the allotted time, and we've still got about I don't know how many, but quite a few to go still. So can we just try and sort of track the questions we've got and try and keep the sort of extra chat to a minimum to address them. What we will do is still leave an opportunity for you to send any extra questions through into the inquiries mailbox. They'll get forward to us, and we will make sure that we add them to the Q&A sort of response document that we're going to publish. So I'm going to, excuse me a second.
I can take over, Colette, if you're gonna cough or
Sorry
sneeze.
if I finished joking. Yes, I just got a bit of irritation in my throat. So I think that probably the PSR question we've probably already addressed. When will the new market message be finalised? I think we're going to take that one offline, and we'll give you the answer in the Q&A responses on that, but shortly. I know that's probably not ideal, but we'll try and make sure it's done very quickly. Different to what you've shown here, so unless we attended today, we wouldn't know this. We will make sure that we send out a proper communication to everybody on anything that we do, and of course, because some of these things we might need to consider anything to do with the governance. The change as published, if we've got to do any updates, we'll have to have a process to go through to communicate all of those changes. So please be aware we are mindful of that. Who is responsible to audit the SIP? The member supplier, the REC. The REC will, as part of their responsibilities under their MEM accreditation. How do we get visibility of audit results for our customers and notification of any incidents that might be found? Okay. I'm not quite sure what the perspective of that is.
Well, if, say, for example, there was a fire at the property, or there's overheating at the meter point.
Yeah.
How do we get visibility of that if somebody's found that? How do they tell us? Or if they're out auditing their own men, which I would assume they would do, audit their own work, it wouldn't just be REC's responsibility. And they find something, how do we find out about that? Because it's our customer's property. At the moment, we've got a relationship with the appointed MEM. And we obviously chat to them on a regular basis. We get audit results, we get incident notifications if anything's found on site. How do we build that? How do the SIPs then provide us with that information?
That's a good question. It's not one that's come up before. So I don't have an immediate answer for you on that. I think if you don't mind, I'll take that one away, and we'll chat with our colleagues on that one and see what we need to do. So if you can please bear with me on that one, Anne, we'll see what we can put back to you in the Q&A response, because it's, as I say, it's a new issue we hadn't considered. Next question. This seems to be pitched to existing MEMs, not new companies doing this. Can new ones become a MEM if they want to do EV installs, for example? So we specifically targeted this at somebody who is an existing MEM, or if you've got the ability to be an accredited MEM and you can meet the requirements to be a MEM, then you can become a SIP. Simple as. If you're not a MEM operating today, you need to become a MEM and follow that process before you can become a SIP. What is the proposed notification process? It's jumped around. I think we've got that same question twice. What is the proposed notification process, timescales for SIPs to attend site? The notice required prior to a site visit. There's a notice required to a site visit at least one day before to the DNO. So that they're aware of any off supply notifications that they get. There's no pre-notification required to the supplier. Will the flow version number of existing flows be changing? That's a question for Ryan.
Yeah, I've addressed this one partly in the chat, but Claire's had some follow-up questions to that. On further review, I think there's only 2 of the proposed flows that will have version numbers change, and that's looking at it as 135 and the D5 itself, because in both those cases we're potentially adding new groups. I don't know if this was considered during workshopping. Obviously, there's as Claire points out, it'll affect multiple industry participants, and so there's clearly quite a big comms piece on that. But I think, yeah, sort of 2 points on that. Well, it's 2 of the flows suggested that will likely have new version numbers. So yes, the version numbers of those flows will be changing, and I think there's an action on us there to make sure that that's then as broadly communicated out as possible.
Ryan, just on that point, as that's going to affect data collectors who aren't actively engaged with the reg, there's going to have to be some, let's say, breadth to that communication. Yes. And I imagine that there'd be some pushback when companies realise the significance of the changes that need to be made in what's now quite some short time frames.
Yes, understood.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I was trying to get myself off mute. Okay, so I think that Claire's question has been addressed. A SIP leaving a site de-energized, can you confirm this action would only be allowed under category A issues? I'm not sure we can say it's category A only, because there may be instances where it's not possible to re-energize afterwards. It might not, and I don't have all the scenarios, but I think it may well be that it's not immediate. It doesn't meet the threshold for category A. I think with some scenarios earlier we talked about that might be category B. So I think that would be the outcome they expected. I don't know if Richard or anyone with more technical knowledge on the meter point might be able to answer that.
So sorry, hi Claire. So this is the SIP leaving a site de-energized. This action would only be allowed under Cat A issues. So I think that is this, you've de-energized site, but there's an issue has become apparent that's an immediate danger. I think you would report that as a category A, and the DNO would be out on site within 3 hours like they do now. So, and I think was that the
I think the question
main point
is more of a, if they're expecting that's only the scenario of category A, that the SIP can leave the site de-energized, but I think there may be scenarios with category B where it may need a MEM to attend to maybe replace a meter or something, which you might have to leave it de-energized while the MEM attends.
No, we can't do that, because a Cat B, it takes 28 days, 28 working days, so we can't leave a customer off supply for 28 working days till a Cat B is resolved.
So would a category B be you can't de-energize the job can't be undertaken?
Okay.
So
yeah,
I think that remains re-energized, but you would report that to the DNO, and the DNO go, right, we clearly need to, within there. Well, there's no KPIs associated, but it's DNOs of, they meet it. I don't think there's a concern that they wouldn't meet it within the sort of agreed industry timescales. So I think this must be it's de-energized and for whatever reason cannot be re-energized again.
So that could be the customer's installation is dangerous as well.
That was the gist of my question, to be honest.
Oh, was it?
I was thinking of scenarios outside of our control. For example, the customer's installation being horrendous, or even the customer throwing you out the property because they don't want you to work there anymore and you've left it de-energized.
I guess if there was a danger to DNO equipment, an immediate danger, it's an interesting point. I see what you mean. It's work undertaken by a contractor that then's led to some danger. Now, in theory, I guess the SIP at that point may not be there. You could argue that you've de-energized, and then it's like, right, I'll be back a bit later to re-energize once the work's done. Ideally, all in the same day. It's a good point, isn't it? I would say if you, I guess if a SIP was there and they saw some danger, I think you would, I'd imagine the DNO would definitely want to know about it. And it would probably seem appropriate to call that in.
What if it's not on the DNO's equipment though? What if it's the customers? What if they've got a reverse polarity on their side?
I wonder what happens now? I think that's the question we need to answer.
I think certainly from my perspective, we've got a process where if we're leaving a customer off supply on site, that we get notified, and we've got a procedure internally just to make sure that the customer is obviously not vulnerable, or we've made them vulnerable, and you know, whether there's any hardship, so that we can try and help them out, and try and give them some guidance on which route to go down. But if a SIP's out there and does that, they've got no recourse back to us.
So there's definitely a flow that goes if you can't re-energize, isn't there? I think if it's over 24 hours, the supplier would know that you've been unable to re-energize. But this is a safety problem, isn't it? I think this specific question. Now, it seems to me, and I don't. I guess this is a scenario that could happen now, isn't it? Like, assuming the supplier's gone out and de-energized and it's done properly, and then someone fits an EV charger, for example. If something then presents a risk, I think what happens now is the question we need to answer, isn't it? What does that EV charge installer do? Because
but the thing is, these are not questions for us. Basically, if you get on site and there's a category A thing wrong with the cutout, then you phone that in and you call the DNO, and you potentially stay on site and wait for the DNO to arrive. That is currently the protocol that you follow. You would only leave site if you can leave it saved under agreement with the DNO. If it's with the metering equipment and it's classed as a category A in your opinion, in other words, it's immediately dangerous to a customer, then you would have to phone and find out who that supplier is and get them to get the MEM round MEM round ASAP, because you've got a scenario on site which is immediately dangerous to the customer. These are Electricity at Work Act issues. If then you find there's something wrong with the customer's equipment, then you would potentially leave it isolated at the isolation switch that you fitted, and then they would have to get, and you would leave them a warning notice, and they would have to get their people round, their electricians, to sort it out. You wouldn't necessarily leave site if you, as the operative on site, thought potentially it could still be dangerous to a person. This is just a normal course of action that everybody is doing normally on a daily basis, or you would expect them to. There's nothing new here or potentially different for a SIP than being a MEM or any other electrical person working on site.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. But in addition to that, though, that we've had, as a supplier, we've had pushback from BAE since we started installing smart meters, whereby they're saying put procedures in place so that you've not got a customer off supply for any period of time, and this is why we've got procedures in place to do that. But if a SIP is doing it and all they're sending us is an industry flow, do you realise how many industry flows we get? And we would have to put checks and balances in for every single flow coming in from this SIP to make sure that that customer's not being left off supply. And by then, we could be talking 24 hours later, whereas at the moment, we've got an immediate notification coming in from our MEM telling us, by the way, we've had to leave this customer off supply, whether it's for gas or electricity. So this is where it becomes a bit muddy, when we've got somebody on site that we're not aware that they're actually going to go there, and then they've just left our customer off supply by fitting an isolator, leaving it in the off position, and like leaving them a notification to tell them they need to get their sockets fixed or whatever it is that the problem is. Do you know what I mean?
Okay.
So we're starting to get that disparity again, when BAEs have been pushing us to make sure that we don't leave customers vulnerable.
Yeah. Sorry, Anne, and to cut this off, because we have reached, we've actually gone beyond the time that we've got allotted for this conversation. I think actually there's still quite a few questions to go, and I think we probably could have gone on for quite a lot longer. I think what we'll do, thank you ever so much, everybody, for all your questions and all the discussion. It's been really useful. We have got a record of all your questions, and obviously there's a recording so that we can listen back and take a note of all the discussion points. We will aim to get a Q&A document out to everybody, not just the people that attended today, to everybody, you know, within the next few days. And I think if we still feel at the end of it there's still questions or there's some further discussion needed, then we'll organise another session and get everybody back together. But I think it's been really helpful and really useful, and I think we've identified a couple of issues that we definitely need to consider how to resolve them in terms of the technical implementation. And we've got some interesting questions to deal with about process. So we'll perhaps try and separate out the things that are process related versus things that are related to the technical flows and things like this. So I would just like to say to everybody, thank you very much. All of this feedback has been really helpful, really appreciated. And I want to thank Richard and Ryan for also supporting the session today, and we will as I say, get this document put together. We'll review it internally with Ryan and Richard as well to make sure we've got answer to all your questions. And thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Millie just to wrap up the session. Thank you.
Thanks, Colette. Yeah, I appreciate a few of you have dropped off because of the time. Just a quick one from me. Obviously, the recording will be made available beginning of next week, and obviously there's quite a few questions, so I'm not sure how long it's going to take Colette to collate all those responses, but that will also be made available next week, and we'll definitely include that in next week's bulletin just so you can obviously have sight of that as well. If possible, if you're still here and have time, we do have a survey. If you could just quickly, it's just a quick one to say how useful you found it, and if there's any comments you have on today's event and how we can kind of improve it going forward. We really do appreciate that feedback. But that's it from us. Don't want to take too much more time. I know we've run over, so apologies for that. But yeah, I think it's been really engaging, and yeah, there's been lots of questions. So thank you. And yeah, have a great rest of the Thursday and rest of the week. And yeah, look out for kind of comms around this next week. Thank you.
Yep.